Picture this: 14 years of queuing for scraps, a single egg per week, and watching neighbours secretly stash contraband meat no enforcement officer would find. What rationing really looked like in World War II was nothing like the sanitised version you see in the history books. The official story tells us everyone pulled together in cheerful unity, dutifully accepting their meagre portions with stiff upper lips. Except that's not quite what happened. The reality involved thriving black markets and a nation that spent nearly a decade post-winning World War II, still living like they were losing it. Before the war kicked off in September 1939, Britain was spectacularly dependent on the rest of the world to feed itself. We're talking about importing roughly 20 million tons of food every single year. About 70% of our cheese and sugar came from abroad, nearly 80% of all fruit, and around 70% of cereals and fats. We even imported more than half our meat. For a nation of 50 million people living on a relatively small island, this made perfect sense economically. The problem was that Nazi Germany knew all of this just as well as we did. One of Hitler's primary strategies in the Battle of the Atlantic was brutally simple: sink the ships bringing food to Britain and starve the nation into submission. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes like wolves, hunting down merchant vessels. Ships were going down regularly, taking with them not just vital supplies, but the lives of merchant sailors who were doing one of the most dangerous jobs of the entire war. The government faced a stark choice. They could allow a free-for-all where those with money could hoard supplies while working-class families went hungry, or they could introduce a controlled system that guaranteed everyone got something. Surprisingly, about 60% of Britons actually wanted rationing when pollsters asked them. Many believed it would guarantee fair shares and prevent the panic buying that had already started in late 1939. The system began cautiously with petrol rationing in September 1939. Food rationing followed in January 1940, starting with bacon, butter, and sugar. The phased approach meant people had time to register with their local shops. By August 1942, almost everything except vegetables and bread was rationed. What nobody realised at the time was that this wouldn't be temporary. This was going to fundamentally reshape British society for the next 14 years. But how exactly did this massive undertaking actually function on a day-to-day basis? The mechanics of rationing were surprisingly complex for something that affected every single person in the country. Every man, woman and child received a ration book filled with coupons. You had to register with specific local shops, and those shopkeepers would then receive enough stock to supply their registered customers. When you bought something, the shopkeeper would tear out or stamp the appropriate coupon from your book. This tied communities together in ways that modern supermarket shopping never could. The system divided into two main categories. Basic staples like meat, butter, sugar and bacon were rationed by specific amounts. Then there was the points system for items like tinned goods, dried fruit, cereals and biscuits. Each person got a certain number of points per month and could choose how to spend them. The points values changed based on supply and demand. The actual amounts people received varied throughout the war, but a typical adult's weekly ration in the middle years looked something like this: 4 ounces of bacon or ham, which is about 4 thin slices. 1 shilling and 10 pence worth of meat, roughly half a pound of mince. 2 ounces each of butter and tea. 4 ounces of margarine and sugar. 1 ounce of cheese. 3 pints of milk. 4 ounces of jam. And if you were lucky, 1 egg. That single egg per week became something of a symbol of wartime scarcity. Children and pregnant women received different rations that prioritised their nutritional needs. Kids got more milk, and expectant mothers could access extra eggs. The National Milk Scheme provided a pint of milk for every child under 5. Free orange juice and cod liver oil were distributed to keep young people topped up with vitamins. Workers in heavy industries got extra rations to match their calorie needs. The Ministry of Food employed around 1,900 enforcement officers to make sure everyone played by the rules. Some of their tactics were controversial. In Hendon, food inspectors used female agents who would deliberately try to trick shop assistants into making mistakes. In a short period, 59 Hendon shopkeepers were successfully prosecuted using this method. The government also controlled prices through the Prices of Goods Act. Restaurants couldn't charge more than 5 shillings per customer for a meal, limited to 3 courses with only one containing meat, fish, or poultry. This was partly a fairness measure to stop wealthy people from eating whatever they wanted while ordinary families scraped by. By 1942, even clothing was rationed, calculated to provide about 1 change of outfit per year. But all this bureaucratic precision couldn't prepare people for what rationing actually felt like to live through. Living under rationing transformed the British relationship with food in ways that lingered for decades. Housewives developed elaborate systems for making coupons stretch, tracking when items would come back into stock, and planning meals around whatever was available. Shopping wasn't a quick trip, but a strategic operation that often involved queuing for hours. The queues became legendary. People would join them without knowing what was being sold, on the logic that if others were queuing, it must be worthwhile. Photographs from 1945 show shoppers queuing in Wood Green to buy whatever eggs might be available. The queuing became a social experience where gossip was exchanged and bonds were strengthened or frayed. Fresh vegetables and fruit weren't rationed, which sounds good until you realise they were often in extremely short supply. Bananas disappeared almost entirely, meaning an entire generation grew up without tasting them. Lemons were reserved for people who could prove they were ill. Oranges were kept for children and pregnant women who could prove their status with their coloured ration books. The government launched the Dig for Victory campaign to encourage growing vegetables. Public parks were ploughed up for allotments. People kept chickens, rabbits and pigs if they had space. This created a divide between rural and urban Britain that caused resentment. If you lived in the countryside, you had far more access to eggs, milk and butter. City dwellers watched enviously as their country cousins enjoyed relative abundance. The Ministry of Food tried to make rationing palatable through propaganda. They created cartoon characters like Dr. Carrot and Potato Pete, who appeared on posters. Food flash films in cinemas gave tips on using simple ingredients. Some recipes were ingenious, others were desperate attempts to make powdered eggs and whale meat seem appetizing. Whale meat never caught on. What surprised many was that the national diet actually became healthier under rationing. Before the war, poverty meant many working-class families were malnourished. Rationing meant everyone got the same amounts, calculated by nutritionists to provide adequate nutrition. Infant mortality rates declined. The irony wasn't lost on people. It took a world war to ensure everyone in Britain had enough to eat. The psychological impact ran deep. Food became something to be carefully managed rather than enjoyed. The government made it illegal to waste food in August 1940. People saved every scrap using carrot tops as houseplants when real ones became unavailable. Fathers saved bits of wood throughout the year to build toys for Christmas. Wedding cakes became elaborate fakes made of cardboard with a small real cake hidden inside. Birthday parties meant going without cake since sugar for icing was banned from August 1940 and balloons were impossible to get. The small rituals that marked celebration became casualties of total war. Yet people adapted with remarkable resilience. An extra bit of butter or an unexpected orange felt like striking gold. But not everyone was content with official rations. And for those with money or connections, there was always an alternative. Where there's scarcity and demand, there's profit to be made, and wartime Britain developed a thriving black market. The black marketeers became known as spivs, a term that's still slang for petty criminal today. Nobody's quite sure where the word came from. Some thought it was VIP spelled backward, others traced it to horse racing slang. Whatever the origin, spivs became a fixture of wartime life, often portrayed in later films and sitcoms like Dad's Army as lovable rogues. The main source of black market food came from farmers who discovered they could make far more selling privately than supplying the government. A farmer would kill 2 pigs but only report 1, hiding the unreported meat in false floors when inspectors came around. Local butchers would participate, selling the illegal meat to customers who could afford inflated prices. One person who lived through it remembered bacon hidden under shop windows behind false floors, wrapped in muslin. They insisted it was the best bacon they'd ever tasted. Cigarettes and alcohol were never officially rationed, but were constantly in short supply, making them prime black market commodities. Shopkeepers sometimes kept limited stocks under the counter for favourite customers, which created tremendous bad feeling. It wasn't uncommon for people to report shopkeepers to the Ministry of Food out of jealousy. The trade in loose clothing coupons flourished, with many being forged. In one notorious Brighton case, 80,000 ration books were stolen from the Royal Pavilion where the food office was based. When police caught the gang, the ringleader turned out to be the woman enforcement officer who had reported the theft herself. She went to prison for 3 years. The penalties for black market activities were supposed to be severe. Courts could impose fines up to £500, plus up to 2 years in prison, plus an additional penalty of 3 times the value of goods sold illegally. The government employed 900 inspectors to weed out black marketeers. Yet prosecutions tell us how common the practice was and how difficult it was to stop. In March 1941 alone, there were over 2,000 prosecutions for rationing violations with a conviction rate above 93%. The moral economy of the black market was complicated. Customers were unlikely to report their suppliers since they relied on them for restricted goods. Many people who wouldn't dream of stealing from a shop had no qualms about buying black market butter. There was a sense that the rationing system was fundamentally unfair in some ways. The wealthy could still eat well in restaurants. Rural people had access to far more food than city dwellers. Why shouldn't working class families with extra money supplement their meagre rations if they could? The contrast between official rhetoric about everyone pulling together and the reality of continued class divisions rankled. When the war ended in 1945, many people assumed rationing would quickly disappear. They were in for a nasty shock. Victory in Europe brought not relief, but in some cases even stricter rationing than during the fighting. The question on everyone's minds was simple: we won the war, so why are we still living like this? The war ended in May 1945 with victory parades and celebrations in the streets. 3 weeks later, on 27th May, the government reduced rations. Bacon went from 4 ounces per week down to 3. Cooking fat dropped from 2 ounces to just 1. This was not what people had expected from peace. The reason was brutally economic. Britain was essentially bankrupt. The country owed enormous sums to its allies, particularly the United States, who insisted on immediate repayment. Germany, our former enemy, wasn't held to the same standard. Meanwhile, Britain had to export its best quality coal for foreign currency while using poor quality stuff domestically. The Labour government elected in 1945 pursued centrally planned economic policies that kept rationing in place even as production theoretically could have increased. Things actually got worse before they got better. Bread, which had never been rationed during the war itself, went onto the ration in July 1946. Potatoes followed in 1947 after a terrible winter, with hard frost and deep snow destroyed huge amounts of stored crops. That same winter saw transport and dock strikes that left imported meat rotting on the docks until the army broke the strikes. The British public was growing increasingly frustrated. They'd endured 6 years of war, making enormous sacrifices, and now peace looked an awful lot like continued hardship with no enemy to justify it. The slow unwinding of rationing stretched across 9 years after the war ended. Clothes rationing finished in March 1949, though many alleged it ended not because the government decided to end it, but because enforcement had been defeated by massive illegality. The black market in clothing coupons, many forged, and bulk thefts of UN-issued ration books made the system increasingly unworkable. Either way, its ending came too late to save the Labour government from public anger over continued austerity. Tea finally came off the ration in October 1952, which for a tea-obsessed nation felt like a genuine milestone. Eggs, cream, sugar and sweets were freed from rationing in 1953. The sight of sweet shop windows piled high with colourful confections that December brought genuine joy after 13 years of watching children ration themselves to 2 ounces of sweets per week. Butter, cheese and cooking oil followed in 1954. The last item to be derationed was meat on the 4th of July 1954, bringing 14 years of rationing to its official end. The day meat came off the ration was treated like a second VE day. People reacted with delight when they could finally walk into a butcher's shop and buy what they wanted without handing over coupons or calculating their remaining rations for the week. The Times reported on shop windows displaying an almost Dickensian abundance of foods to supplement the turkey and pudding that could now be purchased without restriction. That Christmas of 1954 was the first proper celebratory feast for an entire generation of young people who had grown up knowing nothing but rationing. The effects of rationing lasted far longer than the official end date, though. Cheese production remained depressed for decades because during rationing, most milk had been directed toward making one type of cheese called government cheddar. This wiped out nearly all other cheese production in Britain, and some indigenous varieties almost disappeared entirely. Government controls on milk prices through the Milk Marketing Board continued to discourage other cheese varieties until well into the 1980s. It wasn't until the mid-1990s, following the abolition of the MMB, that the British cheese industry truly began reviving. An entire generation had been shaped by rationing. They had learned to never waste food, to be suspicious of abundance, and to view consumption through a lens of scarcity and careful management. These attitudes persisted well beyond the 1950s. People who lived through rationing often continued to save scraps, repair rather than replace items, and view wastefulness as almost morally wrong. The make-do and mend mentality became ingrained. For better or worse, rationing fundamentally altered British culture in ways we're still processing today. Speaking of iconic British brands that survived and thrived through these challenging times, I've got a fascinating video for you about the rise and fall of Cadbury, another cornerstone of British food history. What rationing really looked like in World War II, Britain was 14 years of queues, single eggs, black market bacon, and the peculiar irony of a nation becoming healthier precisely because poverty could no longer determine who ate well. When meat finally came off the ration in July 1954, an entire generation exhaled. Please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss future corners of British cultural history.